An old man walked into a restaurant on a Tuesday in November and sat down at the table in the back corner, table 12, the one near the service door, the one that nobody requested and that the staff seated people at only when everything else was taken, and ordered a cup of coffee and a bowl of soup, and sat there for an hour and 40 minutes without being attended to properly, without being offered a refill, without being asked once if everything was all right. He did not complain. He did not call anyone over. He sat with his coffee and his soup and a patience that the staff would later describe, each of them separately, in almost exactly the same words, like he had all the time in the world. He had signed the papers at 9:15 that morning. The restaurant, the one where he sat at table 12 with his cold coffee and his patience, was his. He had owned it for 1 hour and 53 minutes when the front door opened and a man in a dark jacket walked in, looked around the room, and walked directly to table 12. He sat down across from the old man without being invited, the way someone sits down across from a person they have been looking for. The staff did not notice this for approximately 4 minutes. When they did, what happened next is the reason the head server, a woman named Adeze, went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she could tell her husband about her day. There is a restaurant on Fountain Avenue in Hollywood, California, called Oleander. Not a famous restaurant. Not a restaurant that appears in guides or collects awards or draws the kind of clientele whose presence generates the particular heat of a place that is also a scene. Oleander is the other kind of restaurant, the kind that has been in the same location for 23 years, that has a lunch crowd of people who work nearby and a dinner crowd that is smaller and more local, that has a menu which has not changed significantly since 2009 because the things on it are the things the regulars come for, and nobody has seen a reason to disturb that understanding. The room holds 38 seats across 11 tables, a bar with 6 stools along the left wall, and a service station near the back where the coffee machine sits, and where the staff congregate in the 2-minute windows between tasks to say the things that staff say to each other in those windows. The floors are dark-stained oak that have been refinished twice, and show it in the way that floors show things they have absorbed, the scuffs and the warmth both. The lighting in the evening is low enough to be flattering without being so low that you cannot read the menu, which is a balance that Oleander's management had always understood and maintained. The management, until 9:15 on a Tuesday in November, had been a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald had owned Oleander for 19 years, having bought it from the original owner in a transaction that had taken 11 months to complete, because the original owner had changed his mind twice, and Gerald had waited both times rather than walking away, which was a quality of Gerald's that his accountant found maddening, and that had, on 3 separate occasions in 19 years, resulted in outcomes that would not have been possible if Gerald had been less patient. He was 61 years old, a man who wore the same 4 blazers on rotation, and who kept the menus laminated, because laminated menus were more durable than their alternatives and durability was, to Gerald, a quality that justified most decisions. He had built Oleander into something that worked, not spectacularly, not profitably enough to make him wealthy, but sustainably, which is its own kind of success, and one that is rarer than it is credited for being. In the spring of that year, Gerald had been diagnosed with a degenerative condition that his doctor described as manageable in the near term and less manageable in the medium term, and that would, in the medium term, make the physical demands of running a restaurant, the hours, the floor presence, the particular stress of a business whose margins require daily attention, increasingly difficult to sustain. He had spent 4 months deciding what to do. He had landed on selling, which was not his first choice, but was the honest one, and he had spent 3 months finding the right buyer, which meant the buyer who would keep the staff and keep the menu and keep the particular quality of a place that had been doing something right for 23 years, even if it had never been able to say precisely what the right thing was. The buyer had found him through a mutual contact who knew what Gerald was looking for and knew who was looking. The negotiations had been straightforward. Gerald had named a price that was fair rather than ambitious, and the buyer had agreed to it without counteroffer, which was the first sign, Gerald told his accountant afterward, that the right person had come. The papers were signed at 9:15 on a Tuesday in November in Gerald's office above the restaurant, in the presence of 2 attorneys and an accountant, and nobody else. The buyer had asked to keep the transaction quiet until he had had a chance to introduce himself to the staff properly, which Gerald had agreed to, and which was why, at 11:08, that same morning, the staff of Oleander did not know that the man who had just sat down at table 12 was the person who now owned every chair in the room. His name was Walter Fenn. He was 73 years old. Walter Fenn had been in the restaurant business for 41 years, though not as an owner. As an accountant. Not the kind of accountant who sits in an office and reviews figures at a remove, but the kind who goes into restaurants and learns their numbers from the inside, who reads a kitchen labor report the way a doctor reads a chart, who can tell from a food cost percentage whether the portion sizes are honest. Who knows what a restaurant's P&L looks like when it is being run by someone who cares about it, and what it looks like when it is being run by someone who has stopped caring. He had worked with 212 restaurants in 41 years, in Los Angeles and in Chicago before that, and he had watched more of them close than survive, and he understood, at a cellular level, the difference between the ones that lasted and the ones that did not. He had been retired for 3 years when the mutual contact had called him about Oleander. He had not been looking to buy a restaurant. He was 70 years old when the call came, and he had a garden in Pasadena that needed attention, and a set of unread books that had been accumulating on the nightstand for longer than he was comfortable admitting. He had told the contact he was not interested, and the contact had said he understood. And 2 weeks later, Walter had driven to Fountain Avenue at noon on a Wednesday and had lunch at a table near the window, and had known before he finished his soup that he was going to buy it. He had not been able to say exactly why. He told the contact, when he called back, that the restaurant had a quality he had only encountered in places that had been run by someone who genuinely loved the work, and that those places were rare enough that when you found one, it was worth the inconvenience of not being retired anymore. The contact had said that was the most accountant way he had ever heard someone describe falling in love with a restaurant. Walter had said probably what he had noticed on that Wednesday in November was the staff. Not what they said. How they moved. The way Adiaze, whose name he had not known yet, who was simply the woman in the dark apron who had brought his soup and refilled his water without being asked, moved through the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had internalized the work so deeply that she no longer had to think about it. The way the young man at the service station, whose name turned out to be Tom's, arranged the section before the lunch rush with the attention of someone who understood that the invisible preparation is what makes the visible result possible. The way the kitchen sent the food at the right temperature and the right time on plates that had been warmed, which is a detail that cost nothing and that half the restaurants in the city had stopped bothering with. He had sat with his soup and made his decision and driven home and called Gerald Foss the following morning. He had not told any of this to anyone on the staff. He had not told it to Adiaze or Tom's or to the bartender, an older man named Phil who had been at Oleander for 14 years and who Phil knew that the owner had been sick and the restaurant had been sold, but did not know to whom. Walter had asked Gerald for 2 weeks of quiet. He wanted to come in as a customer first. He wanted to see the place as it was before it knew it was being watched. This was not deception. It was the professional habit of 41 years. You do not learn the truth about a restaurant from the day it knows you are coming. You learn it from the ordinary Tuesday. He had come in 4 times before the papers were signed. Each time at table 12, the table in the back corner near the service door, the one that nobody requested. He had chosen it because from table 12 you could see the entire room, the bar, the service station, the entrance, the kitchen, pass through, without being particularly visible yourself. It was the accountant's table, the table where you could watch without being watched. What he had seen, on the 4 ordinary Tuesdays, was a staff that was good at its work, in the way that a staff becomes good when the person who trained them was good, and when the standards were held consistently over a long enough period that they had become the default rather than the effort. He had also seen, on the 3rd and 4th Tuesdays, the way that table 12 was served, which was to say, not quite adequately. Not cruelly. Nobody had been unkind to the old man in the ordinary clothes at the corner table. They had simply prioritized the tables that seemed to warrant it, which was to say the tables with people who looked like the kind of customers the restaurant wanted to keep. He had noted this. He had added it to the mental ledger he was keeping. Not as a disqualifying entry. Restaurants are run by human beings, and human beings make the same category error that everyone makes. And it was one thing that needed attention, among several things that needed attention. But he had noted it. On the Tuesday after the papers were signed, he came back to table 12. Same coffee, same soup, same patience. This time, he was waiting for someone. The staff of Oleander on that Tuesday morning were a Daisy, who was running the floor, Toms, who was in his 3rd year at the restaurant and his first as a full server rather than a support role, Phil at the bar, a line cook named Sue Jin, who had been in the kitchen for 6 years, and who ran the lunch service with a precision that Gerald had described to Walter in one of their conversations before the sale as the best thing about the restaurant that nobody on the floor ever saw. And a host named Garrett, who was 22 years old and 4 months into the job, and who had not yet developed the read that front-of-house experience eventually builds, but who had in 4 months demonstrated the quality that makes the read possible. He genuinely wanted people to have a good experience. It was Garrett who had seated Walter at table 12 at 11:08. He had done it without thought. The man had come in alone. The room was mostly empty. Table 12 was clean, and the service door wasn't being used yet at this hour. He had handed Walter the menu and said someone would be right with him, and had gone back to the host stand. A Daisy had taken the table 5 minutes later. She had brought coffee, taken the soup order, and moved on to the tables that needed more management. A party of 6 near the window who had arrived with particular dietary requirements. A 2-top whose check had an error that needed to be corrected. She came back with the soup at 11:24. She did not come back after that for 16 minutes, and when she did it was because she was passing the table on her way to the service station and noticed the cup was empty. She refilled it. She said, "Anything else I can get you?" He said, "No, thank you. I'm waiting for someone." She said, "Of course. Take your time." She meant this. She was not trying to move him along. She had too much else to attend to think about the man at table 12 for longer than the 15 seconds she had given him. This is the thing about table 12. It was not malice. It was the mathematics of attention in a restaurant that is neither fully staffed nor understaffed, on a Tuesday that is neither busy nor slow, with a customer who has made himself easy to overlook by choosing the corner, by ordering simply, by sitting with a patience that does not generate the visual signals that pull a server's eye. Nobody decided to treat the old man at table 12 as a drifter. Nobody had the thought at all. That was the thing. He had simply fallen below the threshold that triggers the full expression of service, because nothing about his appearance or his position in the room had pushed him above it. The threshold is not a policy. It is never written down anywhere. It is the accumulated, unexamined assumption of a room about which people in it require its full attention. Most restaurants have it. Almost none of them know they do. Walter Fenn had spent 41 years watching it operate. He was still watching it at table 12 with his second cup of coffee when the front door opened at 12:51 and a man in a dark jacket came in. And Garrett looked up from the host stand, and the man looked around the room for a moment and then walked directly toward the back corner, without stopping at the host stand, and without being intercepted, and without appearing to need either of those things. He sat down across from Walter. He said, "Sorry, parking on Fountain is," Walter said. "It always is." They had met 3 years before the sale, through the mutual contact, at a dinner that was about other things, and that had turned into, by the end of the evening, a conversation between two people who had discovered a shared interest in the specific question of what makes a restaurant last. Walter had the accountant's answer. Keanu had a different answer, which was less systematic and more felt, but which arrived at the same place from the opposite direction. They had stayed in contact since, not frequently, not with any formal structure, but in the way of people who have found a genuine overlap of interest and do not need a reason to return to it. When Walter had called him about Oleander, Keanu had come to lunch, not at table 12, at a table near the window, on a different Tuesday, without telling Walter he was coming. He had wanted to see the room from a different vantage. He had ordered the soup and the bread, and had watched the room for an hour, and had called Walter from the parking lot afterward, and said he thought Walter was right about the staff, and that there was one thing about the room that needed attention, and that he thought it was fixable. Walter had asked what the thing was. Keanu had told him about table 12. Now he was sitting at it. He looked around the room from the corner. The party of 6 near the window had been replaced by a different group, 4 women who appeared to be celebrating something, a bottle of sparkling water on the table, and a cake box under one of the chairs. The 2 top where the check had been corrected was now occupied by 2 men with laptops open. The kind of lunch meeting that runs long, because neither party has a hard stop. Phil at the bar was serving a man in his 50s, who appeared to be a regular. The ease of the exchange, the way Phil had started pouring before the man had finished sitting down. A Daisy came to the table. She saw the menu was still in Walter's hands. She looked at the new arrival. She said, "Can I bring you a menu?" He said, "Please. And whatever he's having looks good." She said, "The soup is very good today." He said, "Then the soup." She brought the menus and the soup and coffee for both, and was efficient and attentive in the way she had been efficient and attentive with every table that had flagged her attention. She had still not thought about table 12 in any particular way. She was managing the floor, and the floor was full, and there was no signal from the back corner that anything unusual was happening. The signal came from Garrett. Garrett had been watching the man in the dark jacket from the host stand since he walked in, with the particular attention of a 22-year-old who has seen faces in films and is working out whether this is one of them. He had worked it out by the time the soup arrived. He came to a Daisy at the service station. He said, quietly, "Do you know who's at table 12? She looked at him. She said, "The older gentleman and someone he's meeting." Garrett said the name. Adaise looked at the table. She looked at Garrett. She looked at the table again. She said, "Are you sure?" Garrett said he was sure. She stood at the service station for a moment. She thought about the coffee cup that had been empty for 16 minutes. She thought about the soup she had brought at 11:24 and had not followed up on. She thought about the way she had said, "Take your time," and had meant it in the way that contains its opposite. The way that take your time can mean I won't be rushing you, or can mean I have turned my attention elsewhere. And about which one she had meant, and whether, if she were honest, there was a difference between those two things in how she had behaved. She walked to table 12. She said, "To Walter, sir. I want to apologize. I should have been back to this table sooner. That was my oversight, and I'm sorry." Walter looked at her. He said, "What's your name?" She said, "A Daisy." He said, "A Daisy. I appreciate that." Genuinely, he said it in a way that closed the apology without dismissing it, that received it fully and then set it down. He did not tell her it was fine. He did not tell her not to worry about it. He said he appreciated it, which was the honest answer, and moved on. She stood at the table for a moment. She said, "Can I bring you anything else?" The man across from Walter, in the dark jacket, with the soup spoon, looked up at her. He said, "Actually, do you have a few minutes? There's someone I'd like you to meet properly." Walter Fenn introduced himself to the staff of Oleander that afternoon, beginning with a Daisy at table 12 and continuing through the room. Toms, Phil, Garrett, and Sue Jin, who came out of the kitchen in her apron with the slightly wary expression of a person being pulled away from work she was in the middle of. He told them who he was and what his background was, and that he had bought the restaurant that morning. He said he had been coming in for several weeks as a customer, which he wanted them to know because it was the truth, and he was not going to begin this with something that wasn't. He said he had seen a staff that was excellent at its work, and one thing in the room that he wanted to address together, and that he was telling them this at the start because the together part was not a figure of speech. He said, every table in this room deserves the same service. Not the same conversation, not the same amount of time, the same attention, the same assumption of value. There are tables in every restaurant where that assumption slips without anyone noticing it has slipped, and I sat at one of yours this morning and noticed. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you because you can fix it. And because a staff that's as good as you are deserves to know when something isn't matching the rest of the work. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sue Jin said, from the edge of the group, in the direct way of someone who has been in kitchens long enough to have no patience for the indirect, "Which table?" Walter said, "This one." She looked at table 12. She looked at Walter. Something moved through her expression, not guilt exactly. The specific acknowledgement of something true being said in a way that could not be argued with and did not need to be. She said, "Fair." She went back to the kitchen. A Daisy stood near the service station and thought about the threshold. She had not had a word for it before. She did now. Walter Fenn ran Oleander for 6 years before he handed it to a general manager he had promoted from within and moved back to semi-retirement, this time with fewer unread books on the nightstand because he had been reading them. In those 6 years, he made 3 significant changes to the restaurant. The first was table 12, not the physical table. The table stayed where it was, near the service door, in the back corner. What changed was the rotation. Table 12 was assigned the same priority in the server rotation as every other table, with a check-in at the 5-minute mark and a follow-up at 12. This was written into the service standards and reviewed at every pre-shift meeting for the first 6 months until it did not need to be reviewed anymore because it had become the default. Garrett, who had been the one to identify who was sitting there, asked Walter in his first formal review whether the change had been because of what happened that day. Walter said yes. Garrett said he was glad he had said something. Walter said he was glad too. He said, "You were new enough to the job not to have learned to stay quiet yet. That's a quality. Don't lose it." Garrett did not lose it. He is the general manager now. The second change was the kitchen. So Jin had been running lunch service for 6 years before Walter arrived, without the title or compensation of a sous chef, because the previous structure had not formalized what she was actually doing. Walter formalized it within 30 days. She has been the sous chef at Oleander for 6 years, and the kitchen that Gerald Foss had described to Walter as the best thing about the restaurant that nobody on the floor ever saw is now, by the specific and consistent account of the people who eat there, the thing people tell each other about when they recommend the restaurant. The third change was a table. In the second year of Walter's ownership, he had a 17th table added to the room, a small two-top in the space along the east wall that had previously held a decorative console and a plant. The table had no number. It was referred to in the reservation system simply as the East Table, and it was treated exactly like every other table in the room, which was the point. Daisy sat at the East Table on her lunch break one afternoon in the third year, when the room had emptied between services and she had 40 minutes, and the soup was particularly good that day. She sat with her phone face down and looked at the room from a table rather than from the floor, which is a different view of the same room, and she thought about the 5 years she had worked there and what she had carried from the afternoon at table 12 into those 5 years. She thought about the threshold, about what it felt like to have it named, about the way Walter had said, "I'm telling you because you can fix it," rather than "I'm telling you because you need to be corrected," which sounded like the same thing and was not. One closed a person down, the other opened them. She had been thinking about that distinction ever since. She had a conversation with a newer server, a woman named Priya, who was 8 months in, a few weeks after the East Table was added. Priya had come to her at the end of a shift with a question about table prioritization, about how to manage multiple tables with different needs at the same time without anyone feeling left behind. Adeze had given her the technical answer, which was about time management and the visual check and the rotation. And then she had given her the other answer, which was about the threshold and about what it looks like when a room is deciding without noticing that it is deciding, and about how the job is partly the mechanics of service and partly the active refusal to let the room decide for you who deserves the full expression of it. Priya had listened to all of this carefully. She had said, "How did you learn that?" Adeze had said, "I was on the wrong side of it once, for about an hour and 40 minutes. She had said it without embarrassment. Not because the embarrassment was gone. It was still there, in a small and useful way, the kind of embarrassment that keeps you honest, because she had decided that the honest account of how you learned something is worth more than the version that leaves out the part where you were wrong. Priya was running her own section now. Oleander is still on Fountain Avenue. It has been there for 29 years. The floors have been refinished a third time. The menu still has the soup. The laminated menus are still laminated, because Walter kept that particular habit of Gerald's, and nobody has argued with it. The photograph of the original opening on the wall near the bar has been joined by a second photograph, taken on the evening of the restaurant's 25th anniversary, in which Adeze and Toms and Phil and Sue Jin and Gerald Foss are all present. And Walter Fenn is in the back corner of the frame, at a table against the east wall, with the expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. Garrett hung the photograph. He chose where to put it. I have been thinking about the threshold, not table 12 specifically. I think most of us know our version of table 12. The corner we put people in without deciding to put them there. The assumption we run on automatic, below the level of intention, that sorts the room into who we attend to fully and who we attend to adequately. The threshold is not cruelty. That is the thing. It is not cruelty, and it is not laziness. It is the human shortcut that saves attention for the places attention seems most needed, and its flaw is that it is the room that tells us where attention is most needed. And the room is wrong about table 12 every single time. What Walter Fenn did that Tuesday was sit in the corner and wait for the threshold to show itself. What he did with it after that was the more unusual thing, he named it, in front of the people who operated it, without making them feel that having it made them bad at their jobs. He said, "You can fix it." And then he was quiet and let the room decide whether it was going to. The room decided it was. I think about a Daisy at the East table on her lunch break, phone face down, looking at the room from a different chair. I think about what it costs to sit with what you did and not make it smaller than it was. I think about saying to a newer colleague, 8 months later, "I was on the wrong side of it once," not to confess, not to perform growth, but because the honest account is worth more than the clean one. I do not always give the honest account. I think most of us don't. We find the version of the story where we were in the 4th row, or where we were almost going to say something, or where the circumstances were such that no reasonable person could have done differently. The version where the threshold was something the room built without us. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe that question is the one to sit with. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known attentiveness to the people and rooms around him. In the quiet way, he has always seemed to notice what others have decided not to see. Drop a comment and tell me what stayed with you, the moment you keep coming back to. Share this with someone who might need to hear it today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. See you in the next one.